On the 16th of April, 2026, as I dive directly into chapter 3 in Gregory Shaw's Theurgy and the Soul, Neoplatonism of Iamblichus. It's about matter as the obstacle to the embodied soul. And so, first of all, Gregory Shaw through Iamblichus starts talking about different views of embodiment that are present in Plato, because apparently Plato speaks both positively and sort of optimistically and pessimistically about the fact of embodiment and how we to make sense of that. And part of the answer here is that these are different perspectives on what it means to be embodied that are appropriate for different stages of the development of the soul in theurgic terms. So, for example, he talks about the perception of the body as a kind of prison. So, a pessimistic view that we're sort of trapped here in these very limited, constrained, and fragile bodies. That this is an important and necessary step in the soul's progress toward complete incarnation. So this is a perception, like it's a view of reality that makes us grasp that we are here, that we're in these bodies, and that we can't get away from them. Like wrestling with the terrible fact of our mortal lives embeds us far more deeply in our embodied being than if we don't admit that and recognize it. On the other hand, at the same time, this a pessimistic, negative view of embodiment functions as a kind of catalyst which purges the soul of an identity which is anchored in the sensible world. Like what he's saying here is that when we can see this negative view of embodiment, it gives us a way of responding to it because it's like, well, what should we do about it? It's a kind of catalyzing recognition that impels us toward, uh, in their view of things, like theurgic worship. So there's a way of, you could say, resonating with the divine in such a way that has a liberating, divinizing function. So they talk about how this negative view of embodiment is seen as a kind of medicinal shock, which is intended to, quote, disturb the soul's complacency. And so it's a way of getting us started on, you could say, the quest. So in this model of religious practice through theurgic ritual, this is sort of like the religious aspect of the Platonic paideia. So there's an educational program, including a pedagogy and a philosophy and also a religious practice through theurgy that has different stages and different kinds of practice that are appropriate to different temperaments and to different students at different levels of development. And so there's a certain kind of perspective here that's being taken on embodiment that is intended to start students out on a particular, not just intellectual, but transformational journey. So certain spiritual exercises deriving from this kind of recognition of the terrible fact of embodiment are intended not just to be intellectual exercises, right, but to be deeply immersive, transformative experiences and stages of development. So again, there are particular religious practices, and you could say philosophical practices, but it's more than what we understand philosophy to be, right? That are intended to uh, literally transform the soul, that take us to a different stage where we can take a different perspective and take up different practices to go along with that. The central insight here is this focus on matter and embodiment. So what's given as part of this, again, like theurgic Platonic paideia and pedagogy is, again, like a set of practices that involve the whole being, which means the embodied soul in this context. So they're, again, not just intellectual exercises, but practices that require full embodied participation. And that level of participation is required for the transformation that is supposed to result. Um, What's also relevant here is not just embodiment, but the participation in matter itself. So we should know by now already that theurgic ritual and theurgic practices, religious practices, involve different uh, sort of conglomerations of material uh, objects. So, for example, there might be a particular ritual that was designed to invoke the god Helios. I'll use Helios again. So then there would be a particular song and particular material objects, particular dress, particular incense, particular stones, particular whatever. There's a whole like paraphernalia associated with that kind of ritual, right? And importantly here, Iamblichus wants to sort of, it's not about idolatry in this context. It's not like those material things that are literally being worshipped. It's what's being talked about here is the difference between artifice or technikos and theurgy or theurgikos in ancient Greek. And so the idea is that see what Iamblichus has to say about it. He says, the creator of the stars and planets, which are true images of God, was Theos, but of artificial idols, Iamblichus says, God is not their maker, but man, nor are they produced out of uniform and intelligible essences, but from matter which has been acquired. What good, therefore, can be generated from matter and from the corporeal powers around matter and in bodies? What he's talking about here is like he's pushing back against idolatry. It's not about worshipping the actual material objects. It's about gathering those objects together in a particular ritual context so that they serve by creating a particular vessel or receptacle for the divine, which is very different. And so that's essentially the essence of what theurgy is about. It's not just about embodiment, it's about uh, bringing together different material objects in a non-idolatrous way. What's partly important about this is that it distinguishes theurgy from sorcery in the sense that it's not about what Porphyry would call manipulation of the gods. It's rather about arranging the chaos of our materiality in particular divine forms such that they can serve to hold, you could say, again, the divine, but I'm still looking to get a bit more clarity on exactly what is meant by that. But that's the basic principle. To clarify that, what we're essentially talking about is communion. The idea is that it could be valuable to take up the perspective of the gods, so to speak, and that there's a particular way of doing that, namely theurgy, that we've sort of forgotten, that Iamblichus is trying to remind us of. And the way to essentially commune with the gods, and we could talk about why that could be valuable, but not at this point. The way to do that is through embodiment and through matter. And so what's paradoxical here is that, again, at different stages of development, matter appears in a different way. So to the soul that has been completely lost in the defilement of matter that is like beset with chaos and all the suffering that goes along with this mortal coil, then matter is an obstacle in that case that keeps souls from communion with the gods. And because of that, like since the gods are free from the pollution of matter, they're intelligible but not sensible. To reach the gods, the soul has to essentially break free from those material bonds. And so I'm going to quote Iamblichus about that, which have to do with this initial perspective on matter and embodiment that has to do with liberation from. So Iamblichus says, quote, just as the gods split matter with lightning and separate it from things which are essentially immaterial, but have been dominated and bound by matter, and from being passive render them impassive, so also our sacrificial fire, imitating the activity of the divine fire, destroys everything material in the sacrifices, purifies the offerings by fire, and frees them from the bonds of matter. It makes them suitable for communion with the gods through the purity of nature. And in the same manner, it frees us from the bonds of generation, assimilates us to the gods, makes us fit for their friendship, philia, and leads our material nature up to the immaterial. And so what we see in that quote is that here matter is opposed to the gods, and that the body is seen as a kind of prison from which souls are then freed. So what we're talking about here is this perspectives that are reasonable to take up at the sort of one of the earlier stages of the development of the soul, which has to do with matter as an embodiment, sorry, matter as an obstacle to the embodied soul. So it's about liberating ourselves from the chaos of our materiality for the sake of communion with the divine. And the fact that it ultimately becomes by way of embodiment and by way of materiality that theurgic ritual functions to allow us to commune with the divine doesn't take away from the value of that initial perspective, which we're trying to take up at the moment. And so as part of that, there's a distinction here from the perspective of the world soul. So someone like Plotinus, for example, there's this relationship between the perspective of our individual souls and the perspective of the world soul. And Plotinus essentially says that they have the same essence, and Iamblichus is saying something quite different, particularly in relation to the topic that we're talking about. So what he's saying is that the world soul is it doesn't have a problem. It's not impeded by embodiment. So for the world soul, embodiment doesn't create any injury or obstacle. And so what's important about that is that our individual human souls are quite partial and quite particular. And because of that, they have a way of being blocked by being in these particular bodies. Whereas, like, what he's saying is that the world soul is a kind of intelligence or animated aliveness that inheres within this world that is more whole. It's more whole within itself. And apparently, according to Iamblichus, that means that embodiment is a virtue or an advantage. And so that's not completely clear to me, but I think what's important there is that we understand the differences between individual human souls, where the partiality of our perspectives lead us to getting entangled within matter, and embodiment becomes a kind of curse or a kind of block. Whereas the world soul within itself is already whole within its own perspective. And that goes along with having the quality of having a spherical body, if I'm understanding correctly. I'm mentioning that because it's going to become quite important later on to clarify these differences between individual human souls and the world soul as we work toward what it might mean to awaken collectively. I won't comment more on that at this point. I'll move on to try and what would it mean to free the individual soul from the bonds of embodiment. And so in connection with that, Iamblichus in the Neoplatonic tradition perceives these mediating entities which tie souls to embodiment. So there's a way that he talks about daimons, literally mediating entities. So he talks about like essentially spirits within nature that bind souls to embodiment. And so I want to get a little bit more clear, maybe not right at this point, about what such powers daimons actually are. But again, I would sort of just mention the work of John Rowan, personification. The fact that we're not used to personifying the forces of nature in this way doesn't mean that it's not a valuable perspective to take up. And in fact, a huge part of the desacralization, the profaning and disenchantment of the world that's taken place over the last 500 years or more has removed our capacity to take perspectives that allow us to see these forces operating in nature. So from this kind of perspective, there are powerful natural forces. Like I might talk about the emotions in this context. There's a way that souls are dragged down into matter through the forces that bind them. Correct. And so according to that kind of a point of view, in order to free the soul from the bonds of generation that tie the soul to matter, theurgy is the way to do that. That involves particular material sacrifices that are designed to overcome daimonic powers of nature. So if I give an example from like I'm trying to understand that in my own terms, I'm sort of saying like imagine imagine anger. Imagine that anger is a certain kind of spirit, the spirit of anger. We can sort of understand how we can see anger metaphorically, at least in that way. Well, my idea would be to create a particular ritual context. For me, that would probably involve rebirthing breathwork as a breathwork facilitator, that was themed around that particular emotion. And I would say, like in that context, I might construct a ceremony or like a ritual context where our anger could be offered to that space, to that occasion. So it's a kind of sacrifice. And the idea is that by uh, allowing that spirit that inhabits us to come to the fore in that context, that it can be released, that we can let go of it, and that as a consequence, that power has less of a governing influence on the rest of our relationships, the rest of our life. So that's an example of how I might enact this practically. I want to steer away from sort of equating or conflating the daemons and the emotions, but I'm going to disentangle that at a different point in time. So we're just imagining from this point. What's important about this recognition is that there are certain forces that lead souls down into nature, certain forces that tie us to materiality. I think the seven deadly sins would also show up in this context. Or like in Buddhism, they have like three sort of original sins, which are, if I remember correctly, ignorance, lust, and anger. And so it's about overcoming those kind of powers, the powers that bind us down into materiality and make us sleep, essentially. And so there's a question here about um, what's the deal with these daemons? Because they supposedly follow the divine will, but like there's a way that we want to be bound to matter, right? As we were sort of saying earlier, we want to be tied down into these bodies so that we recognize the importance of our incarnate life. And the daemons enact the divine will in performing that function. And so in Iamblichus's book, De Mysteriis, these daimons are portrayed as both agents of the Platonic demiurge, which is a kind of organizing, ordering intelligence in the cosmos. But they're also powers that defile the soul by tying it to matter. So they have a very ambivalent character. And so there's just a quote here about these daemons. Quote, their ambivalence was due to their centrifugal activity in being agents of the demiurge in the procession of the gods. It was their task to exteriorize specific aspects of the divine. And in disseminating the divine presence into matter, daimons also led the attention of particular souls into a centrifugal and extroverted attitude. This was what bound them to their bodies and caused them to suffer. So it's sort of like they're performing a particular function of the demiurge, and that can be helpful and beneficial by tying us down into matter, but only up to a certain point, where in the extreme, it sort of binds us into suffering and the chaos of materiality and disconnects us from the divine. As I move quickly toward the end of the chapter here, a little bit more about these daimons, which are really like they play a key role in theurgic ritual. So we're really trying to understand them here. These are personified powers of matter. They're entities whose centrifugal influence on souls was encountered and turned around in theurgic rituals. And so there's a way that if we can balance the influence of these daemons with the perspective of the gods, then their influence can be beneficial, but not overwhelming or debilitating. And so, quote, in the imagery of theurgic rites, Iamblichus pitted the spiritual gods against these material daemons. And so this perspectives are kind of pulling us in different directions. But as the soul is gradually freed from the bonds of generation that tie us to materiality, it begins to participate in the fundamental unity of the cosmos. By fulfilling the commands of a theurgic rite, so by practicing theurgy, essentially, the soul begins to share in the continuity that extends from the gods to matter, and in which the materializing daemons played an important and beneficial role. So it's a way of getting the opposing, you could say, spiritual influences of the gods or of these daemons to work in harmony rather than to work against each other. And the idea is that, again, that there are particular religious practices that facilitate that rebalancing. So from what we've just unpacked, it should be quite clear why there can be an ambivalent view of the spiritual forces that are present in nature, namely daimons, that are regarded as being both derived from the gods, but also having in a sense, uh, chaotic influence. Like they're not necessarily beneficent. To a degree, we're trying to escape them and their influence, or at least overcome their influence. And so, how do we sort of solve that paradox, like of that ambiguity? And Iamblichus explains this. Sorry, Gregory Shaw explains this with reference to the work of an author named Louis, who also talks about Iamblichus in the context of the Chaldean oracles, which are a sort of a key text mystery tradition. The Chaldeans are a people that Iamblichus drew from a great deal. And so Louis, in this context, who's quoted by Gregory Shaw here, talks about Hecate, which is who's a salvific goddess. Um, Sort of equivalent to the Indian Kundalini or Hindu Kundalini. And so, quote, according to the Chaldean oracles, Hecate was queen of the daemons, and as such, she personified all the powers of nature and of matter. Louis explains, quote, the Chaldean Hecate encountered the human souls in forms always adequate to their internal condition. Encounters human souls in forms always adequate to their internal condition. So she appears in different ways. What does he mean? He says, for those sunk in the body, she was necessity. For those who are erring, she appears as demonic temptation. For the renegade, she appears as a curse. For those who recall their divine nature, she appears as a guide. And for those who return home, she appears as grace. So this figure of Hecate appears as a mirror of the embodied soul. Mirror of the embodied soul. And so she reflects the soul's experience of matter and its own internal condition. And so what this is saying is that there is this this figure is someone who essentially personifies the spiritual forces of nature in toto, like in sum, and she serves in a mirroring way depending on the condition of the embodied soul. So she functions as quote, as an index of the soul's spiritual condition. And that means that she only appears in an evil light in proportion to the soul's attachment to its material existence. And that means like she has the kind of ambivalent quality, the same as fire, right? It kind of depends how you approach it. So in the same way, um, she has the she has a function that appears as terrible if we're really bound to our material existence, because then she serves to mirror that and essentially tear us away from it. Embody materiality, like being tied up too much in materiality. And the implication of this is that from a theurgic perspective, matter and the way that we consider matter cannot be treated apart from the soul's existential condition. So the condition of the soul is deeply determining of how matter appears. And just briefly at the end here, Iamblichus then talks about sort of the place of the soul's development, which is a way of considering matter, because so as we're saying, matter can be seen from these different points of view depending on the condition of the soul. And so he uses um, quite a few different terms, namely hyle, phusis, soma, and genesis. Hyle, phusis, soma, and genesis, all quite evocative, as essentially synonyms, all to define the place of the soul's extension and development. And so what these terms describe is the field in which the soul's faculties were developed and tested. And so what this implies is that in a sense, it's a deeper aspect of our embodiment. So there's a way that we can get in touch with hyle or phusis, or what's regarded as soma or genesis here, as a kind of, for me, it's a kind of void space. It's a kind of negative listening space. It's a space of, it's a dark, watchful, luminous, aware presence. And we can become self-aware as that, as hyle. And this is kind of being as the receptacle, being as the vessel, or in Plato, the nurse. And when we can get in touch with that quality, like it's like an existential listening. It's like self-recognition within listening and receiving the world. From that place, we can experience embodied life a little differently, and we can experience it either as a bondage to fate or as an opportunity to live under divine providence, depending on how our soul uses the powers which are granted to it. And so it's basically that from the perspective of matter, as I've talked about it here, hyle, phusis, soma, and genesis, from the perspective of taking up that kind of a place of soul development, embodied life can be experienced in different ways, either as bondage or as a way toward communion. Iamblichus gives a quote here about the soul's relation to fate, which feels relevant to me. He says, "The essence of the soul in itself is immaterial and incorporeal, entirely ungenerated and indestructible, possessing in itself being and life. It's completely self-moved, and yet it's the principle of nature and of all movements. The soul, therefore, to the degree that it is itself, contains in itself self-authority, freedom, and life. The soul, therefore, to the degree that it is itself, contains within itself self-authority, freedom, and life. But to the degree that it gives itself to generated things, to materiality, essentially, it's put under the sway of the cosmos, and to that degree, it's led by fate and serves the necessities of nature." And so what this means is that fate rules only those whose attention has been given over to generated or material things that end up dominating their life. Whereas fate does not rule those who participated in the guiding principle of the soul. We're going to finish off the chapter here with another extended quote from Iamblichus, who's admittedly tricky to understand, but I think worth quoting in this context. So with this as a kind of summary of what we've been talking about. To be brief, the movements of fate around the world may be likened to immaterial and noetic activities and revolutions. And the order of fate resembles this intelligible and pristine order. Huh. The secondary powers, called encosmic gods, are joined with primary causes, or hypercosmic gods, and the multitude in generation. And thus all things under fate are joined with undivided essence and with providence as a guiding principle. In accord with this same essence, then, fate is interwoven with providence, and in reality, fate is providence, is established from it and around it. This being the case, the principle of human actions moves in concert with both these principles of nature, fate and providence. But there's also a principle of action liberated from nature and free from the movement of the cosmos. On account of this, it's not contained in the motion of the world. Thus, it's not introduced from nature nor from any motion, but is pre-established as more ancient, not having been derived from anything. Wherefore, since the soul is allotted certain parts from all the past parts and elements of the cosmos and uses these, it's contained in the order of fate and takes its place in its order and fulfills its conditions and makes proper use of it. And to the degree that the soul combines in itself pure reason, self-substantiality, and self-moving quality, acting from itself and it being perfect, it's liberated from all external things. But to the degree that the soul extends into different modes of life and falls into generation, identifies with the body, it's sewn into the order of the world. Finishing off, that was like, difficult, right? So Shaw ends up finishing off by talking about fate in an astrological context, which is quite interesting. I won't go on about it, but just to say that Shaw says that the parts, like think of IFS here, the parts, internal family systems, the parts given to each soul from the totality of the cosmos make up its astrological portrait, its natal chart when we're born, right? And it's this kind of confluence of elements at a particular junction of time and space that make up the soul's localized self, which serves as a kind of somatic testing ground that measures the soul's ability to integrate corporeal existence into a divine pattern. So when we get subject to fate, we end up failing to fulfill the conditions of our embodiment, which results in fixations and a kind of unfulfillment, which leads to the suffering of our fate. Whereas if we sort of take care of our body properly and our somatic life properly, we can essentially liberate the soul through each of the parts of our constellation, the constellation of our partial embodiment, and in so doing, free the soul from those kind of bonds, which, according to Iamblichus, allows us to see the turnings of fate to be like the perfect revolution of the stars. So it's sort of like, depending how we relate to our own embodiment and to the degree that we can liberate ourselves from material entrapment, then materiality and embodiment can be a positive and beneficent influence on the progress of the soul. But if we get trapped and entangled in matter too much, then the forces that try to realign us with the divine can appear to be terrible, like the influence of the daemons that we were talking about. And fate ends up having a overwhelming influence. And so I'll leave it there. That's been chapter 3, matter as an obstacle to the embodied soul, which is a kind of important to navigate through that carefully at the earlier stages of development that involve realigning the soul away from materiality and toward the divine and communion with the divine through theurgic practice. I'll continue with chapter 4, theurgy as demiurgy.